Hi everyone, welcome to today's workshop. My name is Tori Dalzell. I'm the doctoral writing consultant here at Azusa Pacific University. Today's workshop is all about abstracts. So we'll be talking about different components of abstracts and what the genre consists of and all kinds of different things. Since you're watching the recorded version of today's workshop, I don't have to orient you to the Zoom room. So we'll just go ahead and dive into today's subject. So to start off, what I'd like you to do is just go ahead and choose the option here that most reflects your understanding or your current understanding of what an abstract is. So, is an abstract the introduction to the paper? Is it B, a concise summary of the paper but a standalone document? Is it C, another name for an author's note? Or is it D, a critique of the paper? So in this case, the answer is actually B. It's a concise summary of the paper, but a standalone document. An introduction to the paper it's not going to have all the same components that an abstract is. It's going to be a much more extended background, whereas an abstract is going to have some other components, which we'll talk about. An author's note is a completely separate genre. An author's note is where the writer will talk about the changes that they made or the revisions that they made between drafts to their paper. An abstract is not going to talk about that. And then a critique of the paper is, again, a completely different genre. That is where the critique is going to evaluate a paper and how well it didn't support its argument. An abstract is not a critique of a paper. As we'll see, it's actually a summary of the paper. So this workshop has 4 different parts to it. The first is just talking about what is an abstract. So we'll talk about genre-wise, what is it? The second part is how do I write an abstract? We're going to address specifics of style there. Number 3 is what content should I include or exclude, which is the multi-million-dollar question for abstracts. And then number 4, how are abstracts useful to my writing and research process? Okay, so that's the outline for today's workshop. So the first question we're going to look at is, what is an abstract? It's a couple of different things. One, an abstract is a concise summary of your paper, yet a standalone document. Okay, so this is where people do get a little confused because the abstract and the paper are related, but they are separate. The easiest way to think about the relationship between an abstract and its paper is to think about the relationship between a movie trailer and the full movie itself. So if you as the viewer decide to watch a movie trailer, you should have a pretty good idea about what this film is going to be about. You're going to have kind of the basic storyline, maybe some of the big hits, but you're not going to get like the character development. You're not going to see all the different plot twists that might be there, right? And the trailer is only going to be like a minute or two, whereas the film itself might be an hour or two. So there's a big difference in length there. But if you as the viewer decided not to watch the movie trailer and just watch the movie itself, you shouldn't have missed anything. So the relationship between an abstract and its paper is very similar. If your reader decides to read your abstract, they should have a very good idea of what your paper is going to be about. But if they decide to skip the abstract entirely and just read the paper, then they shouldn't have missed anything. Okay. An abstract actually accomplishes several different objectives, and this is where it can come in handy just in the writing process. First of all, an abstract can be written as a proposal for a paper. So your professor may have asked you to submit an abstract before you've written a paper because they want to know what is your paper going to be about. Right? And so in this case, an abstract can actually give your professor or your classmates, if you're going to do a peer review, what your actual paper is going to be about. Your abstract can actually come in very handy in your writing process as well, because as you're doing your research and as you're writing your paper, you're probably going to end up going down rabbit holes one way or another. And so when that happens, you can actually read your abstract again and decide, is what I'm writing actually going to be part of this paper? Or am I veering off into a completely different argument right now? So your abstract can actually help you keep you on task. And then your abstract can also, at the end of your writing process, revise your abstract to actually make it fit or reflect what your paper actually says. Okay. So in this case, an abstract can actually accomplish several objectives, not just one. And this brings us to our last point where an abstract should make a good first impression. So if you're writing your abstract as a paper proposal, then you'll want to get your professor excited about your topic. Likewise, if you're writing this for peer review, then you'll want to get your peers excited about your topic. As you're doing research for your own paper, you'll probably come across published abstracts. Hopefully, from those abstracts, you'll have a good idea of whether or not a paper or a journal article is actually relevant to what you want to write about. So, hopefully, it makes a good, those published abstracts make a good first impression on you, and help you decide, whether or not this paper or this article actually is relevant to your paper and you should, read it or not. Okay, so the abstract should also make a good first impression on your readers. Okay. Okay, so the next question here, how do I write an abstract? So the material that I'm going to talk about on this slide, it's not original. It was taken from the University of Maryland, Baltimore's Writing Center, so their material on abstracts. And this just has to do with, again, the style of an abstract. So the first thing an abstract should be is accurate. It should actually reflect what is in your paper. It's not a place to put additional information or information that you think your reader should know, but that didn't make it into your paper. That's not what an abstract is for. So you want to make sure that your abstract accurately reflects the paper that you wrote. And again, going back to the movie trailer and the movie analogy, it can be rather disappointing when a movie trailer doesn't actually reflect what a movie is about. Sometimes a movie trailer might, maybe it's actually more exciting than the movie actually was, or maybe the trailer sucked, but the movie was really great. And so, in either way, it's rather disappointing when one doesn't match the other. And so, you want to make sure that your abstract actually matches what your paper is about. The next thing your abstract is it needs to be concise. Abstracts are very short. At minimum, they're usually about 100 words. Maximum for a term paper, it might be 250, 350 words, so not very long at all. Dissertation abstracts can push to about 500 words, but again, abstracts generally don't go over that limit. So you're working with very precious real estate here. And then the next thing your abstract needs to be is it needs to be clear. So because your reader, because the abstract is a standalone document, you don't actually want to spend a whole lot of time explaining key terms or acronyms or things like that. So for that reason, you really want to limit the jargon that you have in an abstract. You can introduce key terms, you can introduce acronyms, especially if those are really important to understanding what your paper is about or to give your reader a better idea of what your paper is going to be about. But again, you really want to limit that because you want to spend the majority of your time actually summarizing your paper, not defining key terms. So what makes an abstract accurate, concise, and clear is not separate from its rhetorical situation. Okay. And so here, yes, you want it to make sure it reflects the message or the main point of your paper. But then the other two things, actually, audience and purpose, are things you really need to consider when you try and decide, what do I actually put in my abstract? So for audience, there's a lot of different topics that different disciplines look at that are the same. So for example, an ethics paper You write ethics papers in nursing courses. Philosophy also deals with ethics, but the way that you write an ethics paper for a nursing course is going to be very different than the way that you write an ethics paper for a philosophy course. And so when you put together your abstract, you still need to keep in mind who is my audience and how do I need to go about actually summarizing and framing my abstract for them. The other is the purpose. So the purpose of the paper or the genre of the paper is actually going to dictate what it means to be accurate, concise, and clear in these cases. And so, for example, if you're writing a lit review, if you're writing an empirical study, if you are writing an argumentative paper, all of those are actually going to determine what goes in your abstract. And again, all of those things are going to determine what it means to be accurate, concise, and clear. So you still need to keep those components in mind as you write your abstract. All of these things lead us to the million-dollar question of what should I include in an abstract? Okay, so abstracts actually share the same share structure with the paper that they reflect. So, for example, I'm going to use two different genres just as examples for this workshop. So here, this is an outline for an empirical studies paper that we would see in a discipline that uses APA. So these components should not be new to you if you're in a discipline like, nursing or psychology. The problem and purpose, the participants, the methods and materials, the findings, and the conclusions. Those are all components we would expect to see in an empirical studies paper. Those same components are going to appear in the abstract, but in a much more concise form. Similarly, in a humanities essay, we expect to see a background and a thesis. We expect arguments to be made in support of that thesis. And then oftentimes we do talk about the methods, the materials, or the kinds of evidence that we use to support that argument. And then we have a conclusion. All of those same components are going to be in a humanities abstract. Okay. So here, okay, so those are the outlines of these different papers. What do those actually look like in abstracts? So here, this is a first example. This is of an empirical studies abstract. And right here, I just went ahead and reverse outlined the different components that I would expect to see in the abstract and where they appeared in this particular abstract. So this abstract, the writers actually start out with the purpose, right? And we know that this is the purpose because we actually have that signal phrase. The purpose of the study was to examine, and then they tell us who the participants are. Participants, in this case, college band and choral musicians, perceptions of conductor clarity and expressivity after viewing band and choral directors conducting with or without a baton. How do they go about doing that study? Here's their methods. One band and one choral conductor each prepared and conducted two excerpts of Guy Forbes' O Nata Lux, a piece written in both choral and band idioms, with and without a baton. Participants viewed 10 excerpts, 4 choral, 4 band, and 2 distractors, and rated the conductor's clarity and expressivity on 10-point Likert type scales. Right, so that's how they did their study. What were their basic findings? There were significant main effects for participant ensemble emphasis, choral or band, baton use, and conductor type, choral or band, and a significant interaction between conductor type and baton use. And so what can we conclude from that? The choral conductor was perceived to be clear without a baton, whereas the band conductor was perceived to be clear with a baton. The choral conductor was perceived to be more expressive with the baton, and the band conductor was perceived to be more expressive without a baton. So here, again, this is just a reverse outlined abstract. Those are all the components that we would expect to see in an empirical study. These components made it into the abstract and actually structured it for us. All right, and so here, this is an example of a humanities abstract. And again, I just went ahead and labeled all the different components that we would expect to see and kind of where they appeared in this particular abstract. So this writer starts out with the background. Though published vocal scores of Broadway musicals imply sole musical authorship, the archives reveal a much more complex picture. And then they give their argument. 5 case studies illustrate different approaches to the compositional process in the 1940s and the 1950s. Richard Rogers, who produced fair copies and piano vocal score for each of his songs. Cole Porter, who regularly used an amanuensis, but later in his career produced detailed fragments of music for his arrangers to turn into performance scores. Frederick Lowe, who worked closely with an arranger to produce fair copies, and Robert Wright and George Forrest, who went through a complicated process of selecting and adapting the work of composers of art music, such as Borodin and Rachmaninoff. How did this person go about doing their study? Detailed study of the available manuscripts made clear that, and then they present their main point, score production was nearly always a collaborative activity on Broadway, whether it involved amanuenses, copyists, arrangers, or orchestrators. Although in each of these cases the named composer retains an authorial role, in practical terms the archives reveal them to be collaborators rather than authors, working as a member of a team to create each performance score. And so what can we conclude from this study? As such, their aims were to facilitate performance events rather than to produce fixed works. Okay, so in each of these components that we would expect to see in a humanities essay actually make it into the abstract and structure that abstract for us. Okay. So before we go on, what I'd like you to do is just jot down any questions that you might have at this point about abstracts or about any of the material that we've gone over, because I would encourage you to bring those questions to your next Writing Center appointment, especially if it has to do with your abstract, so that you can ask your coach. And the other thing I wanted to do before we go on to the next part of the workshop is just give you some information on dissertation abstracts. Everything that I said in this workshop so far does apply to dissertation abstracts, but there are a couple of other things to consider when you're writing an abstract for your dissertation. For that information, I encourage you to go to our graduate writing website. We do have a section on dissertation abstracts and some additional things to consider when putting together your dissertation's abstract. Likewise, you can always bring questions about your dissertation abstract to your Writing Center meeting, to the coaching session that you might have for that abstract. Okay. So this next part of the workshop is actually several examples or exercises similar to what I've done here for you. What I'd like you to do is just give you some more practice on actually reverse outlining abstracts and looking for the different components that we've talked about. Okay. So this first one, this is an empirical studies abstract. So what I would like you to do is go ahead and look for these components. You want to look for the background. You want to look for purpose, participants, methods and materials, findings and results, and conclusions. Okay, those are the basic things that we generally expect to see in an APA empirical study abstract, which this is. So go ahead and take a moment to reverse outline this abstract and label those different components. Go ahead and pause the video while you do so. Okay, so let's go ahead and go over the answer. All right, so here this writer actually starts out with some background, so it's just some additional information to give context to the rest of their abstract. And this is information that they do repeat in their actual paper. Okay, and then they go on to talk about the purpose of their study. Again, they give us that signal phrase, the purpose of the study was to determine ... They then tell us who their participants were. They tell us what methods they used. They give us what their basic findings were and then they do give us that conclusion. So again, what can we learn from this particular study? So that was an exercise for an empirical studies abstract. What I'd like you to do now is go ahead and reverse outline the following humanities abstract. So what you're going to be looking for is the background, the thesis, the arguments, whether or not they talk about methods, materials, or evidence, and then the conclusion. So go ahead and pause the video recording and reverse outline the abstract, looking for those components. Okay, so let's go ahead and go over the answer. So in this case, this person starts out with the background. So they give us, again, the context for what they're looking at. They then go on to present their thesis and their argument. In this case, is kind of, both in the same at the same time. They do talk about some additional evidence or materials that they are using in their argument, or like what else they're wanting to do in this article before giving us that conclusion or telling us, what is the significance of this study? What can we actually draw from this work? Okay. This is a bonus abstract. So I'm not going to tell you whether it's an empirical studies abstract or a humanities abstract. Go ahead and read through it and see just from what's here whether you can determine if it's an empirical study or a humanities abstract. And then go ahead and reverse outline it, looking for those components depending on which abstract you decide this is. So again, you can go ahead and pause the video while you do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and go over the answer. So here, this is actually a humanities abstract. This abstract is written by psychologists and it's published in a psychological journal, but the article itself is actually a history. So it's much more humanities based. And again, this is where abstracts are written according to the genre of writing as well as conventions of the field. So in this case, even though the topic is psychology, it's the history of this particular professional association. And so it's written like a humanities paper, therefore it's a humanities abstract. So here, these writers first just gave us a brief background. They then outlined their argument, and then they decided to end their abstract with their thesis, or in this case, also their conclusion. Okay, so hopefully that just gives you some practice, just looking at abstracts and seeing what components they have and understanding how they're put together. I wanted to end today's workshops by just going over some abstract frequently asked questions that we get in the Writing Center. So the first question is, one, when should I write my abstract? You can actually write your abstract as soon as you start thinking about your paper or project, and then you can revise it through the different stages of your writing. Another question we get is, how specific should my abstract be? As you do your research for your paper and you read abstracts in your field, you'll probably see that some are vague and some are very specific. Some might read just like, this review concludes with implications drawn from the body of research and directions for future study. Or it might just say suggestions for further research are included. And they don't get more specific than that. Other abstracts are much more specific and they actually outline what those implications are. They actually outline what directions for future research should be. There's benefits to both being specific and vague. Some of the benefits to vagueness is that hopefully your reader will be caught by the promise of answers and then read the article. Some of the benefits of specificity is that the reader knows whether or not an article is relevant to their work. And so they can more easily discern whether they should spend time reading it or not. For your own term papers, um, I always think it's better to actually be more specific if you can, because that way your professor actually trusts you more. You provide them with evidence that you've engaged with and distilled your own work, that you understand the material, and that you know what points you are making. And so this just builds rapport with your professor, and so they're more likely to trust you. Another frequent question that we get is an abstract always required for a college paper? And this is where we get this question oftentimes from students who are in disciplines that use APA, because an abstract actually is a component of an APA paper. So APA actually requires an abstract. However, your professor might not require you to write an abstract, even if you are using APA. So this is where you should just ask your professor what they expect. If they want that abstract, then you know to include it. If they say that they don't want an abstract or they say that it's optional, then you know that, that's one less thing that you need to worry about. And then how can I learn more about abstracts? One is to read abstracts in your field. Um, so if you're in psychology, read abstracts in psychology. If you're in music, read abstracts in music. Read abstracts for projects that are similar to your own. So if you're writing a lit review, read abstracts for lit reviews. If you're writing a case study, read abstracts for case studies. And then you can go ahead and reverse outline those abstracts like we did today. If you reverse outline these abstracts, you'll find some different components in them, and then you'll have models for yourself for your own abstract and have a better idea of how you can actually put your abstract together. Okay, and then how can abstracts help my research and writing process? So we've already gone over some of these answers, but I thought I'd go ahead and just repeat them again. One is reading abstracts can help you decide whether to spend time reading a 30-plus page article or not, right? Um, Reading abstracts can also help you decide which studies are relevant to your project. So again, it helps you in that weeding out process as you're doing research, because after you put your keywords into the library database, you're probably going to come up with thousands of different hits. Reading those abstracts can help you decide which are actually relevant to my study, which should I spend my time reading. And then your own abstract actually helps you keep the bigger picture in mind as you write your paper. So you can remember, again, what's my main point here, what's my objective, and that helps you decide what to actually include in your paper. Here are the references for the abstracts that I have used in today's presentation, just in case you're curious, but also to give credit to give credit where credit is due. And that is all I have for today. If you have any additional questions about abstracts, feel free to bring them to your coaching session at the Writing Center, and we look forward to working with you.